All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ally Talks. The Ally Talks is a monthly virtual meetup where we come together to discuss topics around all things website accessibility. Although this group first started in the Drupal world, we're really CMS agnostic, since accessibility issues affect all web platforms. I'm your host, Carrie Fisher, and with me is Mark Casillas, and we're going to be helping field some of the questions. This week, we have Scott O'Hare joining us to talk about everyday website accessibility. Scott O'Hara is a front-end developer and designer working as an accessibility engineer at the Paciello Group, which is a top leader in the world of accessibility. As always, if you have any questions for our speaker, post them in the chat channel or tag them on Twitter with hashtag #AllyTalks, spelled A11yTalks. And again, at the very end, we'll have discussion too, so you can actually just say, turn on your mic and also ask your question there. All right, Scott, take it away.
All right, so hey there, everybody. As Carrie mentioned, I'm Scott. Hi. So like you said, I work at the Paciello Group as an accessibility engineer. I've been dabbling around with HTML and building websites and such like that since the mid to late 90s, but doing it professionally since 2003. I primarily specialize in markup and CSS, SAS, and JavaScript as far as like DOM manipulation and things like that, so that I can build little accessible components in vanilla JavaScript primarily. I care about the user experience of things, which is one of the main reasons that I got into accessibility in the first place. And I have been known to be that opinionated guy about things, usually just things that I think I'm right about. But I try to change my opinions when I am proven wrong. Anyway, let's just jump right on into this. And as this is a talk that's primarily geared towards some introductory, topics per accessibility, I figured that it would just make sense to come right out and talk about what accessibility is, or at least like the framing that I'm going to be having for this talk. And accessibility is basically ensuring that all users, regardless of disabilities, have equal access to information and functionality by inclusive practices, for example, design, development, copywriting, etc. With that in mind, throughout my career, as being someone that cares about accessibility and does such things, I've been asked questions like, how do I get started in accessibility or A11y? And I'm going to stop myself there again to also call out that A11y, A11y, ALI, whatever you want to pronounce it as, is a numeronym for accessibility. I would recommend looking up what numeronyms are, because it is interesting. Anyway, back to what I was saying before I interrupted myself, as I probably will do again and again. How do I get my team to care about accessibility, and how do we make sure we're doing it right? But as we are talking about accessibility, for anyone who has been, working in this type of field, the answer is always, it depends. And that's not a joke. It really always depends. There's no real silver bullet for doing any of this stuff right. On my screen right now is an image of a broken image, in case anyone was wondering why there's a broken image on my slides. But really, outside of very specific scenarios, there are no silver bullets for accessibility, like I was saying. Accessibility is all about people and context, really. And depending on the target audience and context of a page, or a component, the design or UX you may need to have for a particular page or component, it may need to be altered from a standard solution. For example, in some cases where you might have a particular pattern like a tab or an accordion, that may make sense in how it's used on some applications or some websites. But in a different context, in a different setting, you may need to do bits to reorganize or represent that same component. There's no real plug-and-play solution to make sure that one thing is going to work across all projects, is basically what I'm trying to say. But since we have to kind of nail down what it is I want to talk about, we have to start somewhere. Let's take those initial questions that I was just kind of talking about and rephrase them a little bit to make a little bit more sense, I think. So per how do I get started in accessibility, we get started by first finding out whose job it is to be in charge of accessibility at one's company. Per the question, how do I get my team to care about accessibility? Well, there's going to be some team members who will care right away and some that might need some convincing. So let's talk about why. And third, how do we make sure we're doing it right? Context will be the word of the day, but there are plenty of resources and tips online that I want to both talk about and share today. But on to our first point, who's in charge of accessibility? Some teams may include project managers or product managers, designers of the UX or UI variety, developers, back, front, or full stack unicorns, as everybody always wants. There may be content writers, there may be QA engineers, and finally there are likely going to be clients or stakeholders that are on the team, and users. And the reason that users are here is that they're the main reason that we're doing all of this. They will cheer for you, often with silence, when you get the UX of your site or application right. And they will definitely know through support tickets, downvotes, or flat out abandonment if you get it wrong. So, high stakes. Clearly there are roles other than what I've listed here, road mapping experts, operations people, marketing people, etc. But we're going to just kind of talk about accessibility with these types of roles in mind today. But again, who's in charge of accessibility? I just listed out a whole bunch of people. I didn't say who. Everyone, because why not make this as nebulous as possible? But no, really, everyone has a role to play, and even the users. We need to think about them for everything that we do, and not just the affluent, white, 20 to 30 demographic, but people of all ages, races, capabilities. We want to be successful, and we want to make sure that they can use what we're doing, our projects, application sites, successfully. Again, we don't necessarily want to leave any users in the dust, and because they have money that they want to spend with us, and we want their money, typically. Something to think about. I don't really have a slide particularly for this, but in the vein of what is everybody here doing for making sure that all users are in consideration when they are creating their user stories or personas and stuff. How are the personas of your application defined? How diverse are they? Do they include people with disabilities? Just a thing to think about as one way to include accessibility in your company's practices. Anyway, so as I was saying, accessibility can't just be the task of a single person, not even if there's an accessibility lead. It really has to be a team effort, and honestly, in my opinion, it's too much for a single individual to have to juggle alone, especially without creating bottlenecks and requiring that particular person to be an expert at everyone else's job too. As with designers, developers, etc., there are subcategories to accessibility experts. Some are better at implementing design, code, writing language for different accessibility use cases, or understanding compliance than others might be. As a silly kind of example, would you ever go up to your development director and say, well, you know, in air quotes, the most about development, so you can fix the bugs, right? That would probably lead to a really interesting conversation that I wouldn't want to be a part of. But you know, if you think that's fun and dandy, then I definitely recommend you try it out. Again, in my opinion, I think that directors and people specifically in accessibility leads should be directing and identifying complex issues and provide assistance as needed for any kind of remediations. They are knowledge experts, and there may be some tasks that they do themselves that could even go cross-discipline, but it's going to need to come down to individuals within particular roles stepping up to make changes in an organization to meet accessibility compliance. Again, no one person should be expected to know or do everything. This is why all people should be involved. Again, even per the should designers learn to code argument / question, it's not a matter of having deep knowledge, but there is a reason to have a general understanding of everyone's role in your company and what they can do. And as it is understood that your decisions may affect their own decisions that they need to do to move forward with their job and in building accessible solutions. Early and frequent communication will be the key to understanding intent and appropriate accessibility when you are building out your applications and site. As UIs aren't static, designs and specs need to account for all states of a page, components, etc., so that information can be conveyed to people that may, like developers, who may not have deep accessibility knowledge but know how to implement the code that would be needed to make a component or page accessible. On the other end, how would a component or page work with a mouse, if using a mouse, a keyboard, touch device, speech recognition software, or screen reader? Another example, how does the design hold up in high contrast mode, which you can easily turn on using Windows or some other neat little CSS effects that I will try to actually find a link for and send it over to Carrie to put into the notes. Are there content or component changes that occur on a large screen versus small screen? For example, do tabs become accordions and vice versa depending on screen size? And how would those affect user experience? And more importantly, how does that affect the different roles in one's organization and how designs need to be altered? Content labeling may need to change. And again, just how does that change conveyed to a user of assistive technology if, for whatever reason, they go to your page or application in a browser at a certain size one day and then come back the next day at a different size for whatever reason, and now content isn't explained or laid out in the way that they were familiar with. These aren't necessarily questions for a single role to decide on or eventually have to rectify themselves, as everything that I just talked about has ramifications on the intent of other team members and how they see a project or a component of our project moving forward. To continue to beat this horse, I'd like to kind of throw this example out there of, are these buttons or links, or there's actually one in here that is neither. But because of CSS and the way that we can change anything to basically look like anything else, anything could be anything visually, but there are different expectations for users, especially keyboard users or screen reader users, as to how to interact with things like buttons or links or how they are announced. So some additional thoughts on how to basically go through and make sure that the intent of your application is working as, is perceived as need be. Basically going through and testing these things, making sure that they are announced and act as one would expect is incredibly important. Some additional thoughts on things to do when testing and whose job is it to keep these ideas in mind is when you're, when you're testing your application, when you're going through the steps of making sure that things are good for accessibility, whose job is it to point out color contrast issues? Is that on developers to basically run their the project through color contrast analyzers, or to be able to just know inherently to check for those things? Is it on QA to have to test all those things? Or is this something that maybe designers should be doing at the onset of a project to ensure that these kind of things are taken care of up front, as opposed to having to lean on others to ensure that color contrast is met? Another example is, will the language of a page or component be easy to understand by people of various different regional levels or with different primary languages? Again, whose job is it to do that? It really comes down to everyone and making sure that they all take their different perspectives and looking through the copy of a site or an app and making sure that it makes sense to them. But really, it comes down to a copywriter, going into writing the copy of an application and making sure that they're doing it in the mindset of like, this needs to be easy to understand for all users. And again, what is the another thing to consider is, what is the expected reading order of content for a document if CSS wasn't a factor? As we can use CSS to reorder elements on a page. For one example, putting metadata maybe above a heading. Where should some of that information actually lay out if CSS was taken away? Because that's basically how blind users will be interfacing with your application. They'll be parsing through it in the order of the actual DOM. So if you go through your document and things don't really make sense because content is displayed before, like a heading, for example, in a document order, it may make sense to make sure that that is being coded correctly so that it does make sense from a top to bottom perspective. Just because it bears repeating, which I wasn't sure of the appropriate spelling for, this is not just a designer developer dynamic, as accessibility is everyone's job. And now you may be thinking, well, you kind of just talked about a whole bunch of stuff that makes my job a lot more difficult to do. And for that, I'm kind of sorry, but not really. I did say that this wasn't going to necessarily be easy. And that's the only segue I'm going to be giving into how to make my team care about it, which is another really, I think, interesting topic, because it's not really about like, you need to do this, it is your job to do this, because we are people and sometimes we can be lazy, myself included. I like being lazy. Because people really only care about the things that they care about, and people only care about the things that they know that they need to care about. and I have incredibly deep thoughts in case no one has understood that yet. So really, to get your team to kind of care about accessibility, we need to kind of think about it like a soft skill that needs to be learned. You're going to have to, talk to your teammates, and if you are finding that there's any kind of resistance to making accessibility as part of an overall team culture or practice, maybe you don't talk about accessibility anymore. What I mean by that is I've worked on a whole bunch of different teams and with the different, clients over the course of my career, and getting people to care about accessibility has sometimes involved me never actually mentioning that word specifically. Instead, I might mention things like performance and how, a loading screen that, takes forever, and how that's not like appropriately communicated to users of all types, how that can be a real problem, and how people will abandon our application if this isn't taken care of. By improving the performance of the application, I kind of was roundabout getting people to take care of this problem that was a really big accessibility concern. SEO, while SEO and accessibility aren't actually related depending on who you talk to, there are benefits to writing appropriate content that would benefit both SEO and accessibility. Using good headings and unique link text, things like that will help both Google and our actual users. Usability in general, very rarely are you going to find someone that is like, well, I don't want this thing to be usable. God, I would hope not. But, I guess there's all types. But just generally talking about usability and how things are supposed to perform and, the expected user interactions with things. You can get a lot of mileage out of that without, again, having to make it necessarily about accessibility concerns, because it's concerns for all people. And finally, talking about accessibility through means of technical debts, and how if we make a application full of, div soup and shoddy coding practices because of all the different third-party components and frameworks that we've brought in, there may be ways that you can get around some of the accessibility talks by talking about it in that sense, and making people care about, cleaning up their code base, which then again helps our users in the end. But basically, it all comes down to, finding out how your coworkers tick and what's important to them, and weaving accessibility into what they care about. Empathy is also, a pretty effective thing if, you work with empathetic people. But it can be hard for some people to empathize with things that they, aren't necessarily familiar with or aware of. So, make them aware. Help bridge that gap, and don't just tell people that there's an issue, but explain why there's a problem. You can use various tools, videos of people trying to use an application and having difficulty doing so, using real people, and user tests to, again, show how they might be experiencing issues with the way a site is designed or coded. And then always, throwing a person into the shoes of someone with a disability, having them turn on screen curtain mode on their iOS device and having their entire screen go black and not knowing where to touch to be able to access, things on an application, or making them use a keyboard only to access their application that they wrote in all divs. Some quick examples of places to go to look for some really great information on empathy and inclusive design principles. Well, I kind of said the name of the title in here, but this website, inclusivedesignprinciples.org, put out by people at the Paciolo Group, goes through a whole bunch of different principles that one can review, descriptions on each, examples, and how to incorporate those into, the designs that you're working through. Another really interesting project that I like a lot is empathyprompts.net. Basically, a whole bunch of easy to digest ways to, show people how that they can think about their application, things that they can do to put themselves in the role of somebody else and experience an application, how people with disabilities may experience them. Sorry, the tweet didn't load here, but just wanted to also call out that this tweet by Richard Morton were posted that essentially that not all users are the same. I'll read out the tweet for you. There is a false assumption that all screen reader users are experts at using assistive technology and will do things in the same way. One big thing to help out in building accessible applications is to not just assume that people will figure it out. Kind of like what I was saying before, if you find yourself in a situation where a coworker takes the stance of, they'll just figure it out, try to find a way to showcase the difficulty of that train of thought. For example, I used to work with a designer who was super into the light fonts, gray text on a white background aesthetic. And we would have arguments about how, that could be difficult for people with with color contrast, issues to be able to parse through. And I would even get the question of like, well, is this really, can't they just figure it out? Can't they use their screen reader to read that to them? Like, is this really information that needs to be communicated? And, that kind of thinking just like takes into, just assumes that all disabled people always use screen readers. And, some do, definitely those that, have really difficult, hard to access the internet without assistive technology, visual impairments. But there are many people that may have difficulty reading things on the internet with color contrast issues, again, have, glasses, but they might not have them with them, for example. Some people with disabilities just don't even actually identify as having a disability themselves. So you can't just think like, oh, they'll figure it out. Like, it's kind of our job to create good user experiences and not to, kind of shun those that we know may have issues just because we don't feel like changing colors, for example. Again, and, tie it all back to the work that people are doing. Like, no one wants to be doing a bad job, but to help promote bacon accessibility practices in from the start, it behooves us to get our clients and stakeholders and managers on board with these talks of, bringing in accessibility, because they're the people that are going to really kind of care about it in the end. There's been instances I've seen online where people have been like, oh, client doesn't care about accessibility, so, we'll just try to sneak it in. We'll just try to do it in stealth mode. And that's great. You definitely should do that in certain instances. But if accessibility and thoughts about accessibility aren't really baked into the process and aren't cared about at all levels of an organization, you're going to have those people that are potentially in the higher levels coming down with inaccessible ideas that, because accessibility isn't a agreed upon practice in a corporation, those ideas might end up having more weight than truly accessible solutions. Because again, corporate ladders are real and stuff like that. Anyway, moving on from there, I wanted to finish up with talking about some tips and resources. And as I found, the best way to learn is by doing. Reading blogs and specifications is not necessarily for everyone. I personally need to both read and do, and then also have someone show me how I incredibly messed up concurrently. And also, one thing that is kind of like a misconception I've found in the field is that people feel like they need to know everything about accessibility to be able to do it. Whereas I think it's more important to find an aspect of accessibility that interests you and learn specifically about that. By doing so, you will become familiar with other topics related to accessibility. Don't go immediately after everything, but go after one thing, and by proxy, you'll begin to learn other things. So again, start at the beginning, and really is understand what it is that you're hoping to create. I would ask the question, how many of us truly understand what it is we're building anymore with all the frameworks and automatic tasks that kind of do a lot of this stuff for us? Devs, I would say, learn your HTML, and not just the obvious of like, oh, this is a link, this is a button, yeah, I get it. But really understand the semantics of what these elements are meant to do. Sure, select elements can be annoying to style, but have you really sat down and thought about the inherent usability and accessibility expectations that are lost when a custom dropdown is used instead of a select? Have you ever, I would imagine, but using a select or a combo box, whatever you want to call it, on a desktop in all the different browsers, it all behaves slightly differently. And then using it on your phone, especially on iOS, I'm actually not super familiar with how Android does it, but on iOS, the select box comes up and takes up half the screen so that you can easily flick through the different options of the select. When you disregard that element in favor of something that's, again, easier to style, you've lost all of that inherent functionality, and people have to interact with it in a way that they may not have thought they would need to. Another example, do you really understand what the difference is between an article and a section? And do you know that you don't actually need heading elements in your header? And does knowing that, specifically about the heading, change your mind about where heading level 1 needs to go in your application or your website? Typically heading level 1, I've seen on a lot of sites, contains the name of a website, for example. But really, is that the primary heading of your page, or is the actual page's like primary article main content heading the H1? And maybe your logo should just be inside of an A tag or a paragraph tag within the header. Another thing that I would say is, really understand the role that CSS plays. For the most part, CSS is for styling only, but there are other things that with CSS that will affect the accessibility of a page. For example, CSS content used with the before and after pseudo selectors has mixed support in various assistive technologies. For example, I've tried using VoiceOver and accessing the content that's generated by CSS. And in some cases, I've actually been able to. In other cases, it hasn't registered at all. And I know that other screen readers will sometimes just flat out ignore it as well. Accessibility screen readers, they respect display none and visibility hidden to hide content. So if using display none or visibility hidden on a particular element, that will become invisible to all users. But something like opacity 0 will not make it invisible to all users of assistive technologies unless you're using Chromevox, which does treat accessibility 0 as a completely, opacity 0 as a completely hidden item. And another thing pertaining to CSS is, did you know that display block will actually destroy table semantics if you try to make responsive tables and basically change the table cells and table rows to stack on top of each other for small screen views. A lot of the different screen readers will actually report a table as containing 0 columns and 0 rows if you do things like that. So those are, just some interesting little bits that I wanted to talk about in terms of how CSS, again, it's largely for styling, but it can actually have an effect on the accessibility of your content if you don't know exactly what it is you're doing with it. Another topic of both pertaining to user delight and UX is that I've found, at least, that a lot of designers kind of think of them as the same thing, is that they want to delight their users with everything that they do and, basically create head rushes of euphoria as they go through an application. It's a little silly, I think. But user delight and UX is not necessarily the same thing. I think that user delight is well rooted in opinion, and UX is not necessarily rooted, but is much more in line with facts that you can gather through user testing, for example. User delight I would associate with things like parallax scrolling and even scroll jacking, where some people really might like these interactions and think that they make application more interesting and fun to interact with. But as far as the UX of those things, I would submit that they are abnormal and unexpected, and they can potentially be frustrating, and in the case of parallax scrolling, nauseating for some people. With all that said, I don't mean to make accessibility sound boring and that you can't do fun things with it, but I would love to see people try to be a little bit more creative in other means. For instance, try thinking about the things that aren't super exciting about user interfaces, like error messages and empty states, and when you have a whole bunch of call to actions or menu items and you just kind of shove them all into a more drop down or something. What are things that can be done to make these things both more accessible and interesting? Thoughts that I thought I would throw out there. Next, I would say that embracing progressive enhancement is incredibly important and goes hand in hand with accessibility. This doesn't mean that you need to make your website or application fully functional without JavaScript, and I actually would not say that that is what I mean whatsoever and what progressive enhancement even means. But it does mean that you need to create accessible experiences from the ground up. So if a visitor had come to your site without JavaScript, there shouldn't be any controls that need JavaScript to function in that scenario. The content should just be there. There shouldn't be any buttons, for example, that would require it on a click event to make something happen, because this would be a situation where nothing could happen. So you could progressively enhance your site to not have those buttons there in case JavaScript was blocked or turned off for some reason. A reduced content scenario that still makes sense would be another way to progressively enhance a site or application. So like a message stating JavaScript is required to view this page would be a great kind of message to have in a situation where JavaScript was turned off, and otherwise you would just be met with a blank page. Let's try not to do blank pages. Next, I would say that there are always the standard checks as far as how to kind of like immediately do accessibility testing and understanding for your own site. So, you know, are there appropriate alt attributes for images? Appropriate alt attributes for images could range from, you know, a brief description of what an image is, or an alt attribute that has a 0 value, like empty quotes, to indicate that an image is for decoration purposes and should not be parsed by screen readers. You know, as I was kind of talking about before, you know, is there a logical heading order where headings range from H1 to H6 with every level down in heading indicating a change in topic? Links should go places and buttons do things. Content needs to be keyboard accessible, and that doesn't just mean that you can navigate to it with a keyboard, but that, you know, you get the appropriate functionality and that it makes sense to navigate to. For example, there shouldn't be tab indexes all over the place that allow you to tab to paragraphs. That would be an inappropriate use of keyboard accessibility. And finally, is state properly conveyed, being that, you know, is state of a button or drop down or what have you indicated by means other than just visual? Are there appropriate attributes applied to a component that let a user know through announcement what the state of it is? If you're starting from scratch, which is a great place to start, you can lean on other accessible resources that are already out there. And as everyone will have access to these slides after the presentation, all of these are links. So the WAI-ARIA authoring practices 1.1 is a specification, but it has great examples in there of basically how to build small accessible components. Inclusive components by Hayden Pickering. He has really taken in-depth dive into various different common UI components and written way more than I would ever be able to write about the accessibility of them and how to make them accessible and appropriate user expectations around them. There's the Accessibility Project, which, if you're unfamiliar with that, is a great resource for blog posts and quick articles and links to other accessible patterns and components. The Accessibility Style Guide, again, another great resource to go through to find examples of accessible patterns and components, and the WCAG compliance associated with them. And then DQ's Labs pattern library, which recently came out, I think like maybe like a month ago or so. You know, think Foundation bootstraps, but with an accessibility spin to it. And you know, but we can't always start from scratch, so sometimes you have to work with what you have. So I've also included some links to other things to become familiar with. Per auditing and learning how to audit a website, the WCAG 2.0 compliance specification can be quite large and onerous to those that don't enjoy reading through specifications. But there's also this quick reference guide, which is a great example of you know, listing out all the different success criterias. There's tools in there to be able to filter through them so that you can only look at like single A compliance, double A compliance as you need. This is the screen reader and browser pairings is an excellent little blog post basically talking about how you should be using browser and assistive technology pairings to get the best the best testing results, because it is known that certain screen readers work best with certain browsers. And this post basically goes through and talks about all of them. What's new in WCAG 2.1? This is a blog post talking about some of the new success criteria that's coming down the line as far as WCAG compliance is concerned. And definitely worth a read. Not that these are things that are success criteria right now, but hopefully in the near future they will be. And then as far as automated checkers are concerned, this is a list of various browser plugins or online tools that you can use to test your pages, to make sure you can get some low-hanging fruit as far as like accessibility, compliance, and auditing is concerned. Just a note about automated checkers is that they are not perfect, and they probably won't ever be, at least for quite some time, as context, as I was saying before, is kind of king, and these checkers primarily can only look at the code and kind of try to parse what the code means without the context of understanding like all the language of a page or how a particular component is designed, things like that. So while it might be able to help you in finding inappropriate use of attributes and roles, color contrast, it may not be able to, like none of these may be able to immediately point out and be like, oh, hey, you're using a tab component here, but you don't actually have any JavaScript that allows this tab component to be updated appropriately. So there's always going to need to be manual testing that goes along with automated checkers as well. And then, as far as like getting help from people and not necessarily just specifications, you can join the web A11y Slack or the A11y Slackers on Gitter. Basically, they both put you into the same general channel for accessibility talking, to meet other people and stuff. Slack is not as accessible as Gitter is, which is, at least in my experiences, I think it's only a web-based interface. At least that's the only way that I've ever used it before. Pros of Slack is that they're, of the Slack accessibility team, is that there are a whole bunch of different sub-channels that you can interact with. But again, Gitter only goes to the general channel, and it is more accessible for people. Additionally, there's also the Vox accessibility guidelines, creating an accessible culture on the Shopify blog. And an article that came out recently as I was finishing up this talk was creating an accessibility engineering practice. Basically, this blog article talks about all the things that I probably didn't talk about today in really great detail, and I highly recommend that you read this. So yeah, that's kind of it. Wrapping up, the most important things that one can do to get started in accessibility is really to just kind of get started. You may not always be right, and as far as I'm concerned, that's not really the important part. The important part is that you try to be right and you try to do the right thing. And that is one thing that I wish that more people would do more of. So thanks. I appreciate you listening to me.
Thanks, Scott, for your presentation today. It was really excellent. I put your link to the talk in the chat window, and I'll post it on other social media and Slack channels when we get the chance. And eventually we'll get this also uploaded to the YouTube channel. I know there are some people that had some conflicts today that wanted to attend, so you should have all the resources. Plus, now we have a way to find you on GitHub and on Twitter and other places. So that's really great. You have some questions here in the chat window if you want to look over there. I can read the questions, or if you feel like it's easier for you to do that, or if someone posted the question themselves, if they want to read it, that's completely up to the group. But it looks like Dennis might have had the first one. I don't know, Dennis, if you wanted to ask your questions.
Yeah, Dennis, do you want to say those out loud, or do you want me to read out? And
Oh, he might be muted too. Everyone who comes into the channel is automatically muted.
all right, cool.
But
I'll
yeah, it
just read
says go
out.
ahead.
Yeah, I'll just read out the question and babble my way through an answer. So Dennis asks, as you can style a link to look like a button, are there any downsides to doing this related to accessibility? So yeah, per the example that I gave, and I actually included a link to an excellent article that Marcy Sutton had written on it. There are some downsides to doing this. It's like quite a common practice. So it's like kind of one of those things that people kind of just shrug their shoulders at and be like, well, this is just kind of how it is. Because there's really, in my opinion, no better way to kind of do a call to action thing that most people will understand. But anyway, getting back to Dennis's question, one of the issues with styling links to look like buttons and buttons to look like links is ensuring that the expectations will be there for a user. So per users that may access an interface using like speech recognition software, for example, they might see something that looks like a button on a page, and they might say like next button, assuming that they are going to go to that button, but it's not a button, it's a link, and thus the software will move them past that and bring them to the next button on a page. Or if there's no other buttons on a page, might say that there's no buttons. It's a situation that people can figure out and work around. But it's just one of those things to kind of like think about. Do you want to create situations where people can be led astray or frustrated by trying to do simple tasks? Um, the next question that Dennis asked was, what about learning how to use a screen reader? Do I need to become an expert? And how do I begin to understand the nuances of how an actual screen reader uses a screen reader and interacts with web pages? So per that, I would say it depends. Uh, not every screen reader user is an actual expert with using a screen reader, for example. There's a lot of different controls, ways that you can navigate through content on a page with a screen reader through various different like keyboard shortcuts, or feverishly mashing the tab button. VoiceOver example has what's called like the VoiceOver key, which is really holding down Control Option and then pressing a series of other keys to navigate through a page. So there might be instances where people are using just one type of navigation that they learned and it works best for them, so then they stopped learning. And then there might be instances where people have learned all the different keyboard navigation shortcuts, and they use that to interact with a site or an application. As far as like needing to be an expert, there are a bunch of different resources online of the different keyboard shortcuts to use these different screen readers. Like I know that Apple has full documentation on their site of all the different keyboard shortcuts for VoiceOver. Freedom Scientific has the same for the JAWS screen reader, and I know that there's resources for NVDA as well. And then people like Leon Watson over at the Paciolo Group have written some really great primers on these on the Paciolo blog for keyboard shortcuts that you should know to be able to effectively test using a screen reader. So you can again kind of go to the source and get the full list of commands, or you can read up on people's kind of like abridged versions of what you really need to know. So I hope that answers that question. Next, another question by Dennis. To gain support by clients and or management to request or even require accessibility, how do we get them to understand the business ROI? Again, I think that kind of, is going to depend on the organization. I personally have found success with describing it through the performance and tech debt, and talking about how, yeah, you might have to spend some time to clean up your code base, but, if it's going to eradicate bugs and if you can point to ways that will, by eradicating bugs, will create more, conversions, that is definitely a way to go about it. One example was I had done an audit maybe about a year ago of an online store. And through the accessibility audit, I basically came to the conclusion that the checkout process was completely inaccessible. Like, there were certain elements that were meant to be buttons and were meant to be keyboard focusable, but were not keyboard focusable whatsoever. So in my report to them, after giving my report to them, their question to me was basically, so what should our timeline be on, like, remediating these different bugs that you found? And I kind of snarkily answered, basically, whenever you want to start making money from people that use a keyboard to access your websites, since they can't give you money right now. So that's I found that to be a slightly effective way to get them to understand that there was money tied to accessibility.
Well, not to speed you up or anything, Scott, but you've got a couple more minutes left on our hour, but it looks like Andrew McPherson still has a question. And again, if there are any questions that we didn't get to today, Slack them, direct message us, Twitter, you can find us. So just send them there as well. But if you can eke in one more, that'd be great.
Definitely. Yeah, so Andrew's question was, early points explored, different roles, designer, PM, dev. What if these are separate organizations? For example, a client commissions separate agencies for design and dev. So design is sometimes signed off before dev agency ever sees it. How does the dev agency deal with an inaccessible design if it is presented to them as finished? That's actually a great question. So as I've dealt with it in the past, and again, these are just my examples, so take them, for what they're worth. In a situation like that, I've tried to go back to the design agency and call out these issues. I try to do it in a way where the client, to not immediately involve the client, because you don't ever want to throw someone underneath the bus or anything. It's very likely that these people, this design agency, for example, they didn't make these decisions thinking we're going to screw over these types of people and so that they can't, interact with our design. So kind of going back to them, explaining to them what the issues are, and again, showing them how the issues, would make the application fail in experience for certain people. I've had various levels of success, working with that. Again, it's kind of like people. And if they don't think that they need to care about this, or if they, just kind of decide oh, it's your problem now, then there may not be a whole lot that can be done. But basically just try to take the tact of going into this from a education kind of standpoint and trying to help them out. Obviously, if the client's already seen the stuff and it's signed off on, then it becomes an issue of how do we backtrack so that the client, may not lose things that they really liked about a design. It's a tricky question. But in that regard too, I've also, been presented with things like that in the past, and I've been like, all right, well, let's just make this as accessible as you can. And sometimes that's the best that you can do.
Yep, and
Sorry.
on that depressing note, right? No, we can conclude to this month's meeting, but I know that there's some information from Sam, and Donna also posted about accessibility for biz in the Drupal channel. But thank you very much, and I think if we have any other follow-up questions, just tag it. Just a quick note that next month, Nicholas Steenhout, hopefully I said his last name correctly, he's a website accessibility trainer and consultant, and he'll be giving a talk about accessibility. Don't turn off that JavaScript just yet. So if you're interested in JavaScript or more in-depth coding with website accessibility, that might be a good talk for you. So hope you can join us in October, and thanks again, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you everyone for, listening to me today. I had fun. I hope you did too.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.